We lost her at sea. Control went silent 5 minutes after the rupture. On the deck of the USS Halcyon, the wind was cutting hard enough to sting skin beneath tactical gear. Lieutenant Emily Carter stood apart from the others, hands resting on the rail, eyes fixed on the black horizon where sea and sky erased each other. She was not supposed to be here in their minds, not in the way SEAL teams imagined operators who survived waterborne insertion missions. Behind her, whispers moved like low-pressure systems through the crew. "She's the comms specialist," someone muttered, like that explained everything. It didn't, because Carter had already done things no comms officer was ever supposed to do. The mission briefing had been simple on paper: deep water recon, silent insertion, retrieve black box telemetry from a downed surveillance platform. No one mentioned abandonment. No one mentioned that the ocean had a way of deciding who came back. The first explosion wasn't loud, just a pressure shift under the hull, like the sea itself inhaling. Then came the order that broke everything. Break formation. Continue extraction without Carter. Emily didn't hear the rest of the sentence. She was already moving, not toward safety, toward the edge of the deck where the ocean waited like a decision already made. And in that moment, no one on the ship understood they had just made the wrong call. Because Lieutenant Emily Carter was not the one they left behind. She was the one they had underestimated for too long. And the ocean was about to prove them right in the worst possible way. A faint radio crackle tried to re-establish contact, but it dissolved into static as if the sea had swallowed the signal whole. From the control tower 3 miles offshore, a voice repeated her designation without certainty. "Carter, respond." Nothing answered. On deck, Lieutenant Commander Hayes adjusted his night optics, jaw tight, already calculating acceptable losses. Emily heard none of it clearly anymore, only fragments, like distant thunder beneath water. Her breathing slowed, trained, controlled, the way it always did before impossible decisions. She checked the waterproof case strapped to her chest one last time. Inside it was the only thing that mattered now, the black box signal fragment they had been ordered to retrieve. Not rescue, not her, just the data. And somewhere beneath the waves, something moved that did not belong to any training manual she had ever studied. That was when Emily Carter finally understood the truth about the mission she had been sent to execute. She was never meant to be protected. She was meant to be used. And as the hull lights faded behind her, Emily stepped off the edge into black water without hesitation. The cold hit like a verdict, swallowing sound, direction, and time in a single violent instant, while she descended into darkness that felt less like water and more like a decision the ocean had been waiting to make since the moment she stepped aboard, her training narrowing every instinct into silence, focus, and a promise that whatever left her here would not be the end of her story. Because Emily Carter was still the ocean's deadliest secret alive. "Carter, respond. Carter, do you copy?" The voice fractured over the encrypted channel, breaking into static as the ocean swallowed every trace of clarity. Below the surface, everything felt heavier than physics should allow. Lieutenant Emily Carter drifted downward through black water, her body aligned instinctively to reduce resistance, each movement controlled, economical, trained. The cold wasn't just temperature, it was pressure, memory, and discipline collapsing into one narrowing tunnel of survival. Above her, the hull of the USS Halcyon had already become a fading silhouette, its lights distorted into trembling halos by the shifting currents. No rescue marker followed her descent. No secondary extraction protocol activated. The team had already moved on. Or worse, they had decided she was no longer part of the equation. Inside her sealed chest rig, the black box fragment pulsed with a faint locator signal, intermittent and unstable, as if even the device itself struggled to exist in this depth. Carter's fingers tightened briefly around the strap without conscious thought. She wasn't panicking. Panic was a luxury reserved for people who still believed the situation might reverse itself. Instead, her mind shifted into structured silence, the kind built through years of deep water insertion training where oxygen debt and isolation were treated as expected variables, not emergencies. 300 meters above, the operation continued without her designation being acknowledged. "Proceed with extraction route Alpha," Commander Hayes ordered, voice clipped, final. There was no mention of the missing operative again. Only asset status. Only mission continuity. only numbers on a board that no longer included her silhouette. Emily angled her descent slightly, catching a slow thermocline current that shifted like an invisible conveyor beneath the sea. Her HUD was partially disabled, salt intrusion flickering across one corner of the interface, but she didn't need full instrumentation. She had trained for environments where technology died faster than courage. Her breathing remained steady, measured through the rebreather. Each inhale and exhale a metronome against the chaos around her. A shape moved in the distance, too large to be marine life, too precise to be natural. It cut through the water with an engineered silence that made the ocean itself feel outdated. Carter stopped her descent for half a second, body suspended in neutral buoyancy, eyes narrowing. That was not part of the mission brief. That was not supposed to exist at this depth. Unknown contact detected. She transmitted, voice calm, but the channel barely reached beyond her immediate vicinity before dissolving again into distortion. No response came back from the surface team. Either they couldn't hear her, or they had stopped listening. The black box vibrated once against her chest. A confirmation pulse. A location lock. Not from above, but from below. Emily exhaled slowly. The realization settled in without drama, without fear, just precision. She had not been abandoned randomly. She had been positioned. And somewhere beneath the pressure-dark sea, something answered her presence as if it had been waiting for her specifically to arrive. The mission was no longer retrieval. It was recognition. And Lieutenant Emily Carter was now inside a system that no longer treated her as human, but as a variable that had finally reached its intended depth. Depth is not the problem. Silence is. The voice in Emily Carter's helmet earpiece cut through the underwater distortion like a blade, but it was already too late for commands to matter. The ocean around her had shifted into a different kind of reality, one where sound traveled in fragments, and time felt stretched, elastic, unreliable. She was descending still, but now not alone in direction. Something beneath her was matching her movement, mirroring it with mechanical patience, as if learning her rhythm before revealing itself fully. Above the surface, the USS Halcyon had begun widening its extraction radius. On the command deck, Lieutenant Commander Hayes stared at the tactical display where Carter's icon flickered in and out like a dying signal. "She's outside recovery envelope," one officer said flatly, not as a warning, but as a classification. Another voice added, quieter, almost indifferent, "Mission continuity requires closure." Emily heard none of that. Her world had narrowed to pressure, breath, and the faint vibration against her chest where the black box continued its irregular pulse. It wasn't just data anymore. It was reacting, responding, as if aware that it was no longer being carried, but followed. A sudden current shifted her trajectory sideways. Carter adjusted instantly, body rolling with controlled precision, her training overriding instinctive resistance. She caught a glimpse then, faint geometry in the darkness below. Not coral, not wreckage, something structured, angular, artificial in a way that did not belong to anything sanctioned by naval archives. Her mind labeled it automatically, unregistered subsea architecture. But another part of her, deeper, older, conditioned in classified programs she had never been allowed to fully acknowledge, offered a different conclusion: black box origin. The water around her grew warmer by a fraction of a degree, an impossible detail at this depth. That alone told her everything she needed to know. Thermal disruption meant active systems. Active systems meant surveillance. And surveillance meant she had never been the observer in this mission. She slowed her descent deliberately, stabilizing in the water column. For the first time since entering the ocean, she stopped treating it as an environment and started treating it as a perimeter. Her hand moved toward the compact pulse beacon attached to her harness, but she hesitated. Not out of fear, but calculation. Activating it might alert her team, or whatever remained of it. A low-frequency ping vibrated through the water, not sonar from the surface. Something closer. Intelligent. Directed. Emily turned slightly. The structure below had opened, just enough to suggest an invitation rather than an entry point. Light spilled upward from within it. Not white, not blue, but something in between, like memory trying to become visible. And then, for the first time since she had been lost, a voice entered her channel that did not originate from the Halcyon. "Lieutenant Carter," it said, perfectly clear, as if the ocean itself had learned her name. You were not abandoned. You were expected. Her breathing remained steady, but her grip tightened imperceptibly on the tether of control she still had over the situation. Because in that instant, the mission stopped being about survival. It became about recognition. And Emily Carter understood, with the same precision she used to calculate impossible trajectories, that whatever lay beneath her was not recovering something lost. It was activating something that had already been placed there long before she ever stepped onto the ship. You are not lost. You are inside the grid. The voice did not come from above or below anymore. It came from everywhere at once, as if the ocean itself had learned how to speak through structure rather than sound. Emily Carter hovered in the water column, perfectly still now, her body suspended in a balance between descent and choice. The glowing architecture beneath her had fully revealed itself, and what once looked like submerged wreckage was now undeniably a constructed system, layered, geometric, and impossibly silent for something so alive. She did not move immediately. Movement meant submission to unknown geometry. Instead, she observed. That was what kept her alive in environments where others panicked. The structure was not random. It was a lattice of reinforced alloy and composite veins, stretching outward like a buried neural network beneath the Atlantic floor. Every section pulsed faintly in rhythm with the black box against her chest. Not coincidence. Synchronization. On the surface, the USS Halcyon had entered a holding pattern. Commander Hayes studied the readouts with growing irritation disguised as discipline. We should declare it lost, someone suggested. No one disagreed loudly. In naval doctrine, silence was often consent. Emily Carter's designation flickered once more on the tactical board, then stabilized in an area marked non-recoverable anomaly zone. After that, her presence was no longer discussed. Only the mission remained. But beneath 400 meters of pressure, Emily had crossed into something that no extraction protocol accounted for. A section of the structure unfolded below her, not like a door, but like a system recognizing authorization. The water shifted as if displaced by intention rather than force. Her HUD, partially corrupted, briefly restored clarity for exactly 7 seconds, enough for her to register a designation etched into the inner framework. Black box array / origin node 0. Her heartbeat remained controlled, but her mind, for the first time since entering the ocean, registered uncertainty, not fear, but recalibration. Because this was not a battlefield. It was infrastructure designed around cognition itself. A second voice entered her channel, different from the first, older in tone, more mechanical. Lieutenant Carter, it said, your descent confirms compatibility. Step is required. Her fingers tightened slightly on her harness strap. Step was a simple word, too simple for what it implied. She scanned for exit vectors instinctively, but there were none that didn't pass through the structure itself. She had not been trapped in a space. She had been guided into a condition. Above her, the extraction window officially closed. The USS Halcyon marked her as lost to sea, and operational focus shifted away from recovery. In military terms, she had become a closed file. Below her, the structure pulsed again, stronger this time, responding to proximity, not command. Emily exhaled slowly, then made a decision that separated survival from understanding. She released controlled descent and allowed herself to drift forward, not down, not up, but inward. As she crossed the threshold, light did not blind her. It organized her vision. And in that moment, Lieutenant Emily Carter realized the truth the ocean had been preparing her to accept since the beginning. She was not entering a hidden facility. She was entering a system that had already written her role before she ever fell into the water. You don't swim into it. You surrender into it. The words were not spoken by any human voice Emily Carter recognized, yet they carried the weight of command authority, structured, absolute, and eerily calm. As she crossed deeper into the black box array, the world around her ceased behaving like water. It behaved like architecture designed to think. Light shifted in controlled pulses, forming corridors where none existed a second before, as if the environment was rewriting itself based on her presence. Her boots never touched a floor, yet she felt the sensation of stepping. Each forward movement was translated by the system into something meaningful, something measured. The black box against her chest responded with stronger pulses now, no longer irregular. It was aligned, like a heartbeat finding its original rhythm after being separated from its source. Above the ocean, the USS Halcyon had entered full mission closure protocol. In the command room, data feeds related to Carter had been archived, flagged, and reduced to a single operational line: status, unrecoverable. Lieutenant Commander Hayes stood silently for a moment longer than necessary before turning away from the display. No one asked for a retrieval window extension. In deep operations, silence was often the final signature of acceptance. But beneath 600 meters of pressure, acceptance was not an option. The structure responded again. This time, not with voice, but memory. Emily froze. A fragment of her past surfaced inside her HUD without permission. Not visual data, but sensory reconstruction. A training chamber she had never officially been recorded entering. A different uniform. A different insignia. A program that did not exist in any publicly accessible military registry. Black box unit / phase. 0 reconstruction. Her pulse remained controlled, but something subtle changed in her posture. Not fear. Recognition without context. The kind of recognition that destabilized certainty rather than creating panic. You are inside continuity. The system said again, closer now, as if it had moved with her. Not location. The distinction mattered. Location implied escape. Continuity implied structure. A pathway unfolded ahead, narrow, luminous, extending into depths that did not correspond to ocean geography. Emily analyzed it instinctively. No pressure gradient change. No thermal variance. No biological interference. It violated everything she knew about underwater physics, which meant it was not built for the ocean. It was built through it. Her fingers tightened once on her harness strap, then released. Decision-making under unknown systems required a principle she had learned long before SEAL qualification. If you cannot define the battlefield, let the battlefield define itself around your movement. She moved forward. Instantly, the structure reacted. Not aggressively. Responsively. Like something acknowledging compliance. A second layer of memory intrusion triggered, stronger this time. She saw silhouettes. SEAL operators. A mission room. A briefing she could not remember attending, yet her body reacted to it like instinct. Her muscle memory recognized formations before her mind could justify them. "Why me?" she finally transmitted, voice steady but sharpened. For the first time, the system paused, then answered, "Because you were not chosen at sea." A final corridor opened ahead, brighter than anything she had seen since entering. And within it, a distant signal spike echoed through her chest rig, strong, precise, undeniable. It was not calling for rescue. It was calling for activation. And Emily Carter realized the mission had never been about surviving abandonment in the ocean. It had been about completing the sequence that began long before she ever learned what being left behind meant. Stop resisting. You are already inside it. The voice was no longer external. It felt embedded, like the structure itself had learned how to compress speech into her perception rather than transmit it through sound. Lieutenant Emily Carter moved through the luminous corridor, but movement was no longer an accurate term. Every step was translated by the black box array into calibrated intent, as if her body had become a set of permissions being validated in real time. The deeper she went, the more the ocean disappeared from her understanding of space. Pressure no longer increased. Temperature no longer shifted. Instead, reality stabilized into controlled segments, like she was no longer underwater, but inside a layered simulation designed to mimic depth without obeying it. Her HUD flickered again, this time more stable, revealing fragments of structural mapping that should not exist at this depth or in any known naval archive. Black box core access / 12% synchronization. She didn't speak. She observed. That distinction had kept her alive longer than any weapon system ever issued to her. Ahead, the corridor widened into a chamber shaped like a fractured sphere. Its walls were not solid in the traditional sense. They behaved like memory rendered into geometry, shifting faintly whenever she tried to focus on them directly. In the center floated a suspended interface node, surrounded by slow-moving rings of light that rotated in opposing directions without generating current. And then she saw it. Not a machine, not a console, something closer to a decision point. The black box against her chest responded violently for the first time, releasing a sharp pulse that synchronized perfectly with the structure around her. For a fraction of a second, her vision fractured into layered overlays, mission logs, underwater coordinates, encrypted SEAL classifications, all collapsing into a single repeated phrase. Subject: Carter, Emily // status. Unfiled asset above the ocean. The USS Halcyon had fully detached from anomaly tracking. The official report being compiled in real time labeled her disappearance as environmental loss during deep water extraction failure. No mention of deviation. No mention of structure. No mention of the voice that had called her name beneath the sea. Because in official doctrine, acknowledging unknown systems created liabilities that command structure refused to inherit. Inside the chamber, the voice returned again, but now it carried continuity, not direction. You did not enter the black box, it said. You are part of its completion cycle. Emily's breathing remained steady, but her perception sharpened. Completion cycle. That implied stages. That implied design. That implied she had already been moving through something predetermined long before awareness caught up. The floating interface in the center activated. A projection formed, dim at first, then increasingly precise. It showed a mission corridor she recognized instinctively: training simulations, classified SEAL maritime drills, and deepwater sniper evaluations that were never supposed to overlap. Yet here they were, layered into a single operational architecture. And then the impossible detail appeared. Her own signature. Not current. Not recent. Predated. Filed under a program designation that should not exist in any active military registry. Black Box Unit // Origin Node Participant. Carter, Emily. Her fingers tightened slightly, but she did not step back. Retreat implied ignorance. And ignorance had already been removed from this environment. The system spoke one final line, quieter than before. You were not assigned to the ocean mission. You were returned to it. The chamber stabilized around her, as if awaiting acknowledgement rather than reaction. And for the first time since she entered the sea, Lieutenant Emily Carter understood the true nature of abandonment. She had not been discarded into the ocean. She had been inserted back into a system that had always considered her part of its submerged architecture. Every myth has a receipt. You are holding yours. The voice did not echo this time. It settled, like gravity finding its correct direction inside Emily Carter's perception. The chamber around her was no longer reacting randomly. It was stabilizing, as if her presence had completed a missing parameter in a long-running calculation. Lieutenant Emily Carter stood in the center of the black box core chamber, unmoving. Not because she hesitated, but because movement now required definition. And definition, here, was no longer self-generated. It was granted. The interface node in front of her expanded again, unfolding layers of encrypted structure that resembled command architecture more than technology. Each layer she saw was not new. It was familiar in a way that bypassed memory and went straight to procedural instinct. Her body reacted before her mind labeled it. Access granted // origin reconstruction active, a sequence initiated. The chamber dissolved, not physically, but cognitively. Emily was no longer observing the system. She was inside its recall process. Suddenly, she was somewhere else. A training facility, not officially recorded, not in any branch she had ever served under. Yet her hands remembered the weight of weapons she had never been issued in known service. Her stance adjusted automatically to a firing line she had never consciously learned. Voices surrounded her. Instructors, command analysts, SEAL evaluators. All blurred, all fragmented, as if the memory was being replayed through corrupted archival layers. Candidate shows abnormal adaptation speed. Maintain observation. Do not intervene. Her profile exceeds baseline human maritime thresholds. Emily tried to speak, but the environment did not permit dialogue. This was not a memory she was watching. It was a system verifying her origin. The scene shifted again. Water. Not the ocean she had been abandoned into, but controlled depth simulation tanks. Black visibility. Artificial pressure systems. Target silhouettes appearing and disappearing at impossible ranges. A rifle in her hands. And a number being spoken repeatedly over intercom. 4,112 meters. Again. 4,112 meters. Her trigger finger moved in the memory without hesitation. Not emotion, not pride, just execution. A flash, then silence. The memory collapsed inward. Emily staggered, but did not fall, because the chamber adjusted around her balance instantly, compensating for instability as if she were still part of its operating logic. The voice returned, softer now. You were never recruited into the SEAL program as an external asset. You were seated as an internal variable. Above the ocean, the USS Halcyon registered a final anomaly spike before all signals associated with Carter permanently disappeared from active tracking systems. The official logs sealed themselves automatically, as if obeying a higher classification authority than the ship itself could access. Inside the black box core, Emily saw the final layer of truth assemble itself. Not a mission file, not an identity record, but a deployment origin chain. She was not assigned to missions. She was inserted into operational outcomes that required her existence before the mission could even be defined. The realization did not break her. It clarified her. Because now, every moment of being ignored, underestimated, and abandoned was no longer failure of perception. It was system design. And for the first time since entering the ocean, Lieutenant Emily Carter understood that survival had never been her achievement. It had been the test that proved she was still syncing correctly with the system that created her. There is no outside anymore. Only return paths that were always inside you. The voice did not instruct, it concluded. Like a system reaching the final line of a program that had been executing long before awareness ever loaded. Lieutenant Emily Carter stood at the threshold of the black box core's final chamber, but even the concept of a threshold had lost meaning. There was no door behind her, no corridor ahead in the conventional sense. Only layers of structured reality folding into themselves like a sealed operational memory, finally fully decrypted. The environment responded to her stillness. Not as absence of action, but as confirmation of completion. Every system pulse around her synchronized into a steady rhythm. No longer scanning, no longer testing. Recognizing. The central node expanded one final time. And this time, it did not show her fragments. It showed continuity. A full operational timeline unfolded in front of her perception, not as data, but as lived certainty reconstructed in perfect sequence. She saw herself before she ever understood what she was becoming. Not as a child, not as a cadet, but as a controlled insertion point in classified maritime systems that predated her own identity registration. Black box unit / full integration chain. Every mission she remembered now recontextualized itself. The abandoned at sea event was not an error. The isolation was not failure. The silence from command was not neglect. It was segmentation. Each phase had been designed to remove external dependency, forcing the system to collapse all reference points until only one constant remained, her response under impossible conditions. Above the ocean, the USS Halcyon executed final declassification rollback. All references to Carter were stripped from active operational visibility, replaced with neutralized metadata entries that prevented inquiry loops from forming. In military systems, she no longer existed as a missing asset. She existed as resolved architecture. Inside the chamber, Emily finally understood why she had never been retrieved. Retrieval would have broken the cycle. The voice returned, no longer fragmented across space. It was unified now, as if speaking from within her own decision-making layer. You were never meant to be recovered, it said. You were meant to stabilize outcomes that collapse under uncertainty. The truth did not feel like revelation. It felt like recognition of function. The black box core around her began to retract its complexity, not shutting down, but simplifying, like a system no longer required to simulate ambiguity. The luminous corridors, the shifting geometry, the memory overlays, all converging into a single point of clarity centered on her presence. Emily raised her hand slightly, and the system responded instantly, not to command, to alignment. A data stream formed in front of her, not asking for input, but awaiting directional continuity authorization. The mission architecture was no longer external. It required no ship, no team, no extraction protocols, only her. She exhaled once, slow and controlled, the same way she had before impossible shots, before underwater breaches, before being declared lost in the ocean that never actually lost her. Because now she saw it clearly. She had not been abandoned. She had been isolated until only truth remained operational. And in that truth, Lieutenant Emily Carter was no longer a participant in missions. She was the condition under which missions succeeded. Before the ocean remembers you, it decides whether you were ever gone. The voice did not return this time as guidance or system feedback. It returned as closure. Lieutenant Emily Carter stood in the final convergence chamber of the black box core, but the concept of standing had already degraded into something abstract. There was no gravity in the conventional sense, only directional intent enforced by the system's final stabilization state. Every pulse of light, every structural shift around her, now moved in harmony with a single resolved condition: integration complete. The chamber no longer expanded or reconfigured. It simply existed in perfect equilibrium, as if the entire system had finished rewriting itself around her presence and found no further need for adaptation. And then, the ocean outside disappeared. Not physically, but perceptually. For the first time since her descent, Emily was no longer aware of depth, pressure, or containment. The black box array had fully detached her cognition from environmental interpretation. What replaced it was continuity, a seamless operational field where mission, memory, and identity were indistinguishable layers of the same construct. The final archive sequence activated. She saw everything. Not fragments, not simulations, but complete causality chains stretching backward through every moment she had once believed to be independent choice. Each deployment, each random assignment, each instance of isolation underwater or silence under command, none of it existed as accident. It was orchestration. Above the ocean, the USS Halcyon executed its final log compression. The system erased redundant identity traces associated with Carter, Emily, consolidating her operational history into a single classification string. Black box unit / active core variable. Command personnel on the ship experienced only a subtle update in their records, nothing that suggested loss, nothing that suggested anomaly. In military systems, the most effective disappearances were the ones that left no emotional residue. Inside the chamber, Emily exhaled once. Not relief, not fear, recognition. The voice returned one last time, no longer layered across systems or embedded in structure. It came from a singular point within her own awareness. You were never in the ocean, it said. The ocean was in you. The chamber began to dissolve, not into darkness, but into operational clarity. The architecture, the memory overlays, the classified reconstructions, all collapsing inward, not because they failed, but because they were no longer needed. A final interface stabilized in front of her. No instructions, no mission brief, only alignment status. Black box core / stabilized variable confirmed. Emily did not reach for it. She did not need to, because at this point, action was no longer something she performed. It was something the system executed through her presence. The narrative of abandonment, survival, and revelation ceased to function as experience. It reclassified itself as calibration history. And in the silence that followed, the first true silence since she had been left at sea, Lieutenant Emily Carter understood the final truth encoded beneath every layer of her existence. She was not a soldier who had survived impossible conditions. She was the condition under which impossibility was resolved.